A man collapses on the sun-baked pavement of Chowringhi Road in Calcutta. It is August 1943. Inside the restaurants a few feet away, British officers and local elites are eating multi-course meals, sipping gin, and discussing the war in Europe. The man on the street is dead before the dessert is served. He did not die because there was no food in the city. The markets were fully stocked, the bakeries were baking, the warehouses were guarded by armed men. The food existed. The ships existed. The grain was there. It was simply being rerouted past a dying province to stockpile for a post-war Europe. 3 million people suffered a terminal outcome in Bengal that year. The British government called it a natural disaster, a tragic consequence of a cyclone and bad crops. It was not. This is the story of how Winston Churchill starved 3 million Indians to finance World War II and blamed the weather. This documentary goes inside the mechanisms of the Bengal Famine, exposing the profit inflation policy partly shaped by John Maynard Keynes, the scorched-earth boat denial and rice denial campaigns, the war cabinet minutes that blocked emergency aid, and the severe press censorship that left the outside world in the dark. It is a story about a government that acted deliberately and then spent decades ensuring you never found out. You are standing at the center of one of the greatest cover-ups in modern history. The mystery is not whether millions lost their lives. The mystery is how a region with a near-normal harvest suddenly runs out of food for millions of its own people, and how the architects of that system walked away with their reputations intact. Let us look at the evidence. In late 1941, the geopolitical situation for the British Empire changed overnight. The Japanese military struck Pearl Harbor, then swept through Southeast Asia. Singapore fell. Then Burma fell. The Japanese army was now standing at the eastern gates of India. The British administration in New Delhi and London panicked. They believed a Japanese invasion of Bengal was imminent. Instead of fortifying the population, they initiated a scorched earth policy designed to leave absolutely nothing of value for the invading enemy. They focused on two things: transport and food. Bengal is a massive river delta. It is a region of endless waterways, rivers, and swamps. Roads are practically useless during the monsoon season. The entire economy, the entire physical distribution network for food, relied on shallow draft wooden country boats. In May 1942, the British military enacted the boat denial policy. Soldiers and government agents fanned out across the coastal districts and confiscated, sank, or burned over 46,000 wooden boats. They targeted any vessel capable of carrying more than 10 people. The distribution network died overnight. Fishermen could no longer catch fish. Farmers could no longer move their surplus grain to the markets. Villages that relied on river transport for daily survival were suddenly cut off from the world. But destroying the transport was only the first step. The British administration then enacted the rice denial policy. Military agents were given vast sums of cash and ordered to buy up surplus rice in the coastal districts, specifically to remove it from the area, so the Japanese could not feed themselves if they landed. They confiscated tens of thousands of tons of rice. While the raw tonnage was only a fraction of the total harvest, the physical act of government agents aggressively buying up food supplies sent a massive shockwave through the local economy. It signaled to every merchant, every landlord, and every trader that a massive shortage was coming. Panic buying erupted. Hoarding became the standard business practice. The open market vanished into the shadows. Now you have a paralyzed transport system and a panicked food market. But that alone does not cause 3 million terminal outcomes. To understand the true mechanism of mass death, you have to look at the money. You have to look at London, at the Treasury, and at an economic theory pushed by advisors like John Maynard Keynes. The British government needed to extract immense physical resources from India to fight the Axis powers. They needed boots, uniforms, tents, parachutes, steel, and food for armies across the Middle East and North Africa. Normally, a government funds a war through taxation or by borrowing money from the public. But taxing the Indian population heavily would have sparked massive political rebellion, and borrowing was not enough. So the British government exploited a financial mechanism. They effectively forced the Reserve Bank of India to print vast, unbacked quantities of paper money. This fiat currency was handed directly to military contractors. The contractors used this freshly printed cash to buy up physical goods, including food, from the Indian domestic market. When you flood an economy with massive amounts of new currency without increasing the supply of actual goods, you get hyperinflation. The prices of basic necessities skyrocketed. This was not an accident. This was a calculated policy known as profit inflation. The goal was to force a drastic reduction in civilian consumption by making goods too expensive for the average person to buy, thereby freeing up those goods for the military. The rural poor of Bengal, the landless laborers, were paid fixed cash wages. In early 1942, a mond of rice cost about 5 rupees. Within 18 months, that exact same physical amount of rice cost 30, then 40, and in some districts, up to 80 rupees. The wages of the laborers did not change. Their purchasing power evaporated into thin air. They simply could no longer afford to eat. A human body deprived of calories begins to consume its own fat, then its muscle tissue. The heart weakens. The skin pulls tight over the bones. Millions of people experienced this slow, grinding bodily reality while living in a province that still had food. The food was just locked behind an invisible wall of hyperinflation. Historian Utsa Patnaik argues this was a deliberate financial policy designed to fund the imperial war effort on the backs of the Indian poor. This economic transfer of wealth systematically destroyed the poorest class. They died of starvation outside fully stocked shops. They died on the dirt roads walking toward Calcutta in search of government relief that did not exist. They died on the pavements while British elites ate 5-course meals. The system worked exactly as the financial planners intended. Civilian consumption was forcibly reduced. But the crisis could still have been mitigated if the War Cabinet in London had chosen to act. This brings us to the most documented and most chilling phase of the famine. As the death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands, officials on the ground in India began begging London for emergency food shipments. Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy of India, and Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, sent urgent cables to the War Cabinet. They requested 1 million tons of wheat to cool the inflation and feed the starving. The War Cabinet in London, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his scientific advisor Lord Cherwell, repeatedly rejected these requests. The logs remain. The minutes of those underground meetings sit in the archives today. Cherwell argued that diverting commercial shipping to save Indian lives would disrupt the United Kingdom import stockpile. The UK already had millions of tons of food in reserve, more than enough to feed its population. Yet ships loaded with Australian wheat sailed directly across the Indian Ocean, right past the coast of a starving Bengal, destined for the Mediterranean and the Balkans. They were building a stockpile for the post-war reconstruction of Europe. Millions of Indian lives were deemed expendable to ensure British rations remained high and European buffers were secure. When Amery pushed harder for relief, pointing out the mass civilian casualties, Churchill famously deflected the blame. In one documented response regarding the severe food shortage, Churchill wrote a note on a telegram asking, "If food is so scarce, why has Gandhi not died yet?" The denial of shipping was a structural decision about supply priorities. It determined exactly who got to eat and who did not. The government knew the terminal outcomes were multiplying. So they did what governments often do when faced with the consequences of their own kinetic action. They hid it. The censorship in India was absolute. The British administration invoked the Defense of India rules to suppress any negative reporting about the war effort. The word famine was strictly banned from all official dispatches and telegrams leaving the country. It was referred to as a local food shortage. The outside world was kept entirely in the dark. In Calcutta, the Statesman newspaper, under the direction of editor Ian Stevens, finally broke the silence in October 1943. Stevens defied the military censors and published horrific graphic photographs of starving women and children dying on the streets of the capital. Those physical, concrete images forced the British government to publicly acknowledge the crisis, but by then, the majority of the victims were already dead or dying. Lord Wavell replaced Linlithgow as Viceroy and immediately mobilized the military to distribute food, proving that logistical relief was always physically possible if the political will had existed. The dying slowly stopped, but the cover-up was just beginning. In 1945, the government convened the Famine Inquiry Commission to establish the official historical narrative. They needed a scapegoat. They blamed the weather. They pointed to a cyclone that hit the Midnapore coast in late 1942 and a brown spot fungal infection that damaged the rice crop. They blamed local Indian merchants for hoarding. They built a narrative of natural disaster and local corruption, entirely ignoring the catastrophic impact of profit inflation, boat denial, and the War Cabinet shipping embargo. This official weather narrative became the accepted history for nearly 80 years. It was taught in schools. It was repeated in biographies of Churchill. But modern data destroys the Commission findings. Researchers and economists, including Amartya Sen with his entitlement approach and modern meteorological analyses, have shown that the 1943 rice harvest was only about 5% lower than the previous 5-year average. A 5% drop in crop yield does not cause 3 million terminal outcomes. Government policy does. Contested claims about the exact motives still exist today. Some historians argue Churchill acted purely out of military necessity in a desperate war, pointing out the severe shipping constraints caused by German U-boats. Others, like Madhusri Mukherjee, argue his documented racial animus toward Indians directly influenced his refusal to allocate relief. Utsa Patnaik frames the entire event as a calculated macroeconomic policy of wealth extraction. You can debate the specific personal motives of the men in the war cabinet, but you cannot debate the structural mechanics. The boats were burned by the military. The money was printed by the state. The inflation was created by the Treasury. The shipping was denied by the Prime Minister. The natural disaster narrative is a documented fiction. 3 million humans met a terminal outcome so an empire could balance its war books and build a post-war stockpile. The evidence was buried, the vocabulary was censored, and the blame was passed to the wind and the rain. This is how a modern state engineers a mass casualty event and walks away clean. What do you think is the real reason the British archives fought so hard to keep the specific cabinet minutes quiet for so long? Tell me your theory down in the comments. And if you want to understand how the British Empire used covert intelligence assets to manipulate the American entry into the war, you need to watch my next video. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss it.